There was a time when silence didn't bother him. When life was busy, noisy, and demanding, his mind felt anchored by constant motion. There was always something to respond to, something to fix, something pulling his attention forward. But as life slowly became quieter, something strange began to happen. Instead of feeling relieved, he started to feel lost. Nothing was wrong. That was the unsettling part. His responsibilities were under control. There were no major problems demanding his attention. No crisis to react to. And yet, when the noise faded, he felt disoriented, as if something essential had been taken away. The quiet didn't feel peaceful. It felt confusing. At first, he assumed the feeling meant something was missing. Maybe he needed a new goal, a new distraction, something to chase. But every time he filled the silence, the feeling only paused. It never disappeared. The moment things slowed down again, the sense of being lost returned, heavier than before. Psychologically, this happens when the mind becomes accustomed to constant stimulation. When life is loud, the mind doesn't have to decide what matters. Urgency does that for you. Deadlines, pressure, and expectations create direction, even if that direction isn't meaningful. When the noise fades, that external structure disappears, and the mind is left to face itself without guidance. He noticed that when life was chaotic, he never questioned where he was going. Movement itself felt like purpose. But in quiet moments, when nothing demanded him, a deeper uncertainty surfaced. Without urgency, he didn't know where to place his attention. Without noise, he didn't know what he cared about. This is why quiet can feel uncomfortable for people who are otherwise functioning well. Silence removes direction without replacing it. It doesn't tell you what to do next. It simply reveals the absence of inner clarity. And that absence feels like being lost, even when everything on the outside appears stable. He realized that he had relied on activity to define his sense of self. Productivity, progress, and responsibility had given him identity. When those things slowed down, the identity weakened. The mind began searching for something to hold on to, but nothing obvious appeared. Being lost didn't mean he had failed. It meant he had never been taught how to orient himself without external pressure. Life had always pointed him somewhere. Now it wasn't pointing at all. And without direction, the mind felt exposed. Most people don't fear chaos as much as they fear stillness. Chaos tells you where to look. Stillness asks you to decide. When there's no noise to react to, no urgency to obey, you're left with a question that doesn't have an immediate answer. What actually matters to me when nothing is forcing me to move? That question doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels destabilizing. The mind would rather react than choose. It would rather be pushed than pause. So when life becomes quiet, confusion appears, not because something is wrong, but because the mind has never practiced clarity without pressure. Feeling lost in quiet moments isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign that direction has always come from outside rather than within. And until that internal direction develops, silence will continue to feel uncomfortable, not peaceful. When he stopped fighting the feeling of being lost, something subtle shifted. The confusion didn't disappear, but it stopped feeling threatening. Instead of trying to escape the quiet, he stayed with it long enough to notice what it was actually doing. The silence wasn't empty. It was unstructured. And his mind, so used to reacting, didn't know how to exist without instructions. He realized that most of his life had been shaped by response rather than choice. When something demanded his attention, he responded. When pressure appeared, he moved. When expectations were placed on him, he adapted. Direction had always come from outside. The quiet removed all of that, and for the first time, he was required to choose where his attention should go. That responsibility felt heavier than any deadline he had ever faced. Psychologically, feeling lost in quiet moments happens when identity is built around motion instead of meaning. Activity provides a sense of purpose even when purpose is unclear. Stillness exposes the absence of that deeper orientation. The mind mistakes this exposure for failure, when in reality it's simply unfamiliar territory. Nothing is broken. Nothing has gone wrong. The mind is just learning how to stand without leaning on noise. As the days passed, he noticed that the urge to fill the silence came from discomfort, not necessity. Distraction had been a way to avoid uncertainty. But uncertainty wasn't dangerous. It was simply unresolved. When he allowed himself to sit with it, the feeling of being lost began to change shape. It stopped feeling like panic and started feeling like openness. This openness was uncomfortable because it offered no direction. But it also offered possibility. For the first time, his attention wasn't being pulled. It was available. And in that availability, subtle preferences began to surface. Not dramatic passions or life-changing revelations, but quiet signals. Curiosity about certain ideas. A desire to slow down in specific moments. A sense of alignment that didn't demand urgency. The mind doesn't find clarity by forcing answers. It finds clarity by staying present long enough for orientation to emerge naturally. When life is loud, clarity is outsourced to circumstance. When life becomes quiet, clarity must be cultivated internally. That process feels confusing at first because it requires patience rather than action. He understood now that feeling lost wasn't a sign that life had lost meaning. It was a sign that meaning could no longer be borrowed from noise. The quiet wasn't punishing him. It was inviting him to develop an internal sense of direction. One that wasn't dependent on pressure, chaos, or constant movement. Over time, the stillness stopped feeling like a void. It became a neutral space. A place where nothing demanded his attention, but everything was possible. He didn't suddenly know exactly what he wanted from life. But he felt less anxious about not knowing. The urgency to figure everything out faded. Being lost in quiet moments isn't something to eliminate. It's something to pass through. It marks the transition between a life driven by reaction and a life guided by awareness. When that transition is resisted, silence feels uncomfortable. When it's allowed, silence becomes grounding. The quiet didn't give him answers. It gave him space. And in that space, direction slowly began to form, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. He wasn't lost anymore. He was learning how to stand still without needing to run. And that, he realized, was the beginning of clarity.